So in this video, I'm going to talk about anti-squat. And what does it mean? Well, anti-squat is a very literal term. It prevents the car from squatting down on under acceleration. So all anti-squat it is the angle of the rear suspension arm with respect to the ground. So at zero anti-squat, the rear suspension arm is completely flat with respect to the ground. It's perfectly parallel. And then as I increase the anti-squat angle, the front part of the arm lifts up. Okay, so it's very similar to kick up. In a previous video, I described how kick up works in the front of the car. Basically, kick up is like anti-squat at the front, or anti-squat is like kick up at the rear of the car. So the effect is quite similar, except that the rear does not steer the car. The rear just moves the car forward. So if you have a bumpy surface, then if I have more anti-squat over a bumpy surface, that will allow the rear suspension to absorb more of the energy of those bumps under acceleration as the car goes over those bumps. Okay. Now, there's another effect of anti-squat in terms of how it affects the grip level of a car. This is a bit more complex, but basically the idea is in order to generate grip, you have to apply a force to the tires to push the tire to the track to get it to generate friction. Okay. Now, when the car accelerates, that's going to apply a certain amount of total force to the car to get it to move forward. And how much of that force you want to transmit through the tires depends on how much traction you have. So if you have a low traction surface, say it's a loose dirt surface, okay, regardless of whether it's bumpy or not, let's just say it's a low grip surface, then what could happen is the amount of force that the motor is applying to the tires could exceed the grip level that the tires have, and the tires start spinning, okay? In that case, what you would generally do in very generic terms is soften the suspension, either by softening the springs or softening the oil or whatever, so that the suspension absorbs some of that acceleration force, thereby applying a fraction of the acceleration force to the tires. Okay, so the idea there is you want the suspension to absorb whatever energy, whatever force rather, the tires cannot handle in order to maintain grip. Okay, and anti-squat is a part of that. So if I have a particular anti-squat angle, the more anti-squat I have, even though it helps the car behave over bumps, okay, as I'm riding over a bumpy surface, that angle of the suspension arm helps the suspension compress over those bumps. What it also means is that if I have a purely vertical load applied to the suspension, such as, for example, when the car accelerates, weight transfers to the rear, tries to push the suspension down, in that vertical load scenario, I'll get the most suspension travel when the arm is perfectly parallel, right? But as I increase the angle of that arm by increasing the anti-squat, now I'm reducing how much of that vertical force, how much of that acceleration force transfers through the suspension. Okay, so it's very similar to making the suspension stiffer, or it's one way to effectively make the suspension stiffer. So if I have a low grip track that I'm running on, I would actually want to run low anti-squat to maintain forward traction. Okay. The problem is, if you have a low grip track that's also bumpy, then you have to play games with how much anti-squat you're actually willing to accept to optimize the trade-off between forward grip and how much grip you have going over bumps. Okay. But that's what anti-squat does. And typically, you would run anti-squat anywhere between 0 degrees and 3 degrees. So it's a pretty small change in the total angle of the arm, but it does have a significant effect on how much forward traction you have under acceleration. Okay, and it is primarily viewed as a tuning option for acceleration only. So as the car is going at constant speed, or as the car is cornering, any squat will technically have some effect on the suspension behavior, but generally you would use it to tune how much forward traction you have under acceleration. This is the primary function of anti-squat. Okay, I think that's all I really wanted to mention about that. It's a relatively simple tuning option. I personally don't play around with it that much, probably because I don't go racing all across the country, and so I only race on a few different surfaces, and I'm pretty happy with the setup I have most of the time. But it's an important tool to have in your bag to know how to change it. Typically, on modern cars, you might have inserts on either the rear hinge pin mount or the rear front hinge pin mount. And by changing those inserts, you can change how much anti-squat you have and also how much rear towing you have. Okay. On some of the older cars, like on the RC10B4, you would change anti-squat by putting little spacers under the front rear inner hinge pin mount. On older cars than that, like the old RC10s, you cannot change the anti-squat using conventional parts. You'd have to actually put little spacers between the suspension arm mount and the chassis, either at the front screw or the rear screw, and that would be a very hacker way, for lack of a better term, of adjusting anti-squat. Okay, so that's what it does, and that's how you change it. And I think that covers it for anti-squat. So thanks for watching.